Good evening. Thank you all for braving the elements tonight. You get a bonus good star for endurance. I'm Harold Holzer, and it's, as you know, I'm the director of Roosevelt House, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you and to welcome our special guest, who I will introduce in a moment. First, an acknowledgement that two of our wonderful Board of Advisor members are here tonight. Tony Stepanski is here, and the great Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel is here. So welcome. Also, for those of you who attended the first annual Chris McNichol Lecture on Integrity in Government, there will be a second edition, and Chris McNichol is here to make sure that we make good on that. So welcome to Chris as well, and thank you for what you do. So it's a privilege to welcome back to Roosevelt House one of the best and best known historians in the field of American history, my friend Douglas Brinkley, Chair of Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University. As many of you know, he is also the presidential historian at CNN, where his vast knowledge and really offer a useful perspective on day-to-day drama that otherwise might drive viewers to distraction. Just listen to Doug Brinkley and you will realize usually, sometimes he gets excited about events, but usually he reminds us that all of this has happened before, and it's always great to see him adding insight and perspective to current events. You probably also know that Doug Brinkley is the author of some wonderful books on both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, which is why he has an open invitation to FDR's house. He spoke here a couple of years ago about Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Land of America, which is such a highly original look at FDR and his naturalist inclinations and preservationist land preservation and water, as Doug pointed out. Really, I think you were a pioneer in that, in discussing the Everglades and other things that FDR was interested in. And yes, there is also, with his new book, Moonshot, which he's kind of debuting here tonight, there is a connection between traditions. JFK had a relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, or at least he tried to. Eleanor opposed Kennedy for the vice presidential nomination in 1956. And when Kennedy began aspiring to the presidential nomination in 1960, she was pretty dismissive. She didn't like his record in the McCarthy era. She didn't like his lack of interest in disarmament. Anyway, she wrote a very famous telegram, well, now famous telegram to JFK, who after all was I'm not going to say the author, but the Pulitzer Prize winner for Profiles in Courage, right? And she wrote to him, "My dear boy, I only say these things," meaning her recent criticism, "for your own good. I have found in a lifetime of adversity that when blows are rained down on one, it is advisable to turn the other profile." Wow. Then she said in a speech, "I would hesitate to place the difficult decisions the next president will have to make with someone who understands what courage is and admires it, but has not quite the independence to practice it." So she was tough. And if you want to know how they healed their relationship, to the point where Eleanor campaigned for President Kennedy in New York and served on his Women's Advisory Commission and served back in the UN during the Peace Corps discussions, the reason is sitting in the front row. William Vanden Heuvel brokered that meeting between Eleanor Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy 59 years ago. So I don't know if he would have won without that healing, the healing of the breach. So, Back to our special guest. Doug Brinkley won, another reason for his being here, won the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Book Prize in Naval History some years back. I learned just last week from a mutual friend that this is a great little tidbit for all of us who are book lovers, that when Doug Brinkley was an adjunct instructor in American history at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, in his spare time, and we have lots of adjuncts here, and in their spare time they rest between classes. In Doug's spare time, I hope this is right, he opened a bookshop and ran a bookshop, an independent bookshop, which is the most treasured thing in New York right now. That is an amazing tidbit. See, I'm still a good researcher, right? So Kennedy was also the father of the space race, which is what brings us here tonight, because that's what Doug's book is about. All the way to the moon, although he didn't live to see that. I remember it because I was covering the moon landing for a weekly newspaper in Central Park, where there was a giant screen set up to watch Neil Armstrong take his giant leap. I was a child at the time, but I still remember it. So Doug has brought both scholarship and his usual narrative verve to this new book, and we look forward to his reminding us of a day that seems so near for us who were there and yet so distant. We look forward to his telling us about a president who knew that Mars was not a part of the moon, and the moon was not a part of Mars, and for whom new frontiers were not a barrier, but an opportunity. As always, we'll have a talk followed by a Q&A, and then a reception upstairs and an opportunity for you to get an inscribed book from our special guest. And with that, please welcome Doug Brinkley.
Thank you, Harold. My admiration knows no bounds for you for what you do here in your great scholarship in American history, and it's always an honor to be here, and it was a wonderful introduction. Nobody knew I used to have a bookstore in Annapolis. That's very, very good intelligence gathering you did, but I admire you immensely. And the late Stephen Ambrose, historian's daughter's here, and Grace is in the front row, and she's been working on programs for toddlers that are blind and are able to have walkers so they can move around, a kind of project Eleanor Roosevelt would have really admired tremendously. So thank you for being here. Ambassador Vanden Heuvel knows that he's my hero, and he knows how much I love him, and our friendship is very deep. His new memoir's out about his life with Wild Bill Donovan and dealing with Adlai Stevenson and Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, on and on. Just one of our great American statespersons, and to me, truly been a great mentor in my life, and I don't say that in just idle passing. So look, the idea of my book, American Moonshot, came like Harold was just telling us. He watched it in Central Park. I was in a town called Perrysburg, Ohio. I was 8.5 years old, and I was transfixed by Neil Armstrong going on the moon. As a whole generation was. That was our hero. You know, John F. Kennedy's generation, Kennedy was born in 1917, had Charles Lindbergh, his flight across the Atlantic, but my generation was all about Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. And it was an added oomph to the event because down the road from Perrysburg is Wapakoneta, Ohio, where Neil Armstrong was from. And so he was really kind of a local boy made good syndrome where I grew up. I mention that because it's Neil Armstrong that got me into writing American Moonshot, and in a roundabout way, I had sent him my first book, a biography of Dean Acheson and a biography of James Forrestal, and I inscribed them, and I got Neil Armstrong's P.O. box, and I randomly sent him these books and said, Mr. Armstrong, I'd love to interview you. You know, went on a little bit about that, knowing he hated the media. He was just really never was, I wouldn't say a hermit, but really didn't like doing interviews. I thought maybe being the local, I can get to him. And I got back a little note from his assistant. Mr. Armstrong will read one of the 2 books you sent him. And he doesn't do interviews, but if something ever comes up, we'll keep you in mind. A very polite blow-off. Well, lo and behold, about 7, 8 years later, I got a random phone call from NASA saying that Neil Armstrong is turning 70. He's going to do an oral history, and he'd like you to interview him. And in addition, your father, Stephen Ambrose, and I went with Steve, and we went to NASA, and it happened right around the time of 9/11. We have the helicopter incident here in town right now. But back when a few days when it was scheduled in September to interview Armstrong, 9/11 happened, and all airspace was closed. And lo and behold, NASA said Armstrong doesn't cancel anything, and he flew his own plane from Cincinnati, landed, walked out, and were able to interview him for an 8-hour afternoon. And it just was a dream for me to get to do that. And then I now teach at Rice University, where famously on September 12th in 1962, Jack Kennedy gave that an incredible speech where he said, "We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard." That was a great speech in public discovery. He connected the new sea and the ocean to Columbus and Magellan. He talked about that the future is in space technology, and it's just a remarkable presidential address. That speech was given at Rice University football stadium, a stone's throw from my office, in front of about 35,000 people, 10,000 of them Boy Scouts. And it really captures that era of when Houston, Texas turned into Space City, USA, and the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs captured our nation's imagination. Now, when I decided to write, those are my 2 things that inspired me. When I started going at this book, I picked it up in 1917 when J.F. Kennedy was born. And we all know the story of Joseph Kennedy and his father and the children and the Kennedy clan and all the like. But remember, John F. Kennedy was of the generation where he was part of aviation. The Wright brothers wasn't until 1903. And as I mentioned, in 1927's Charles Lindbergh, and in World War I, we started having aviation as a big thing. And when Kennedy grew up, we started getting, for boys, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and the like. And so that period of 1920s in aviation is quite storybook stuff, the beginning of America leading the way in aviation. But it was also when a man named Dr. Robert Goddard, operating at Clark University, not that far from Brookline and Cape Cod and Cambridge, started testing rockets in a field, in a cabbage field in Auburn, Massachusetts. And Goddard would put these rockets liquid fuel. Up until Goddard's liquid fuel rockets, people thought to go into space it had to be like a gunpowder effect, like a cannon that would put a trajectory up into space. The big game to get to the moon, the first big step was, how do we break Earth's gravitational pull to get to outer space? How do you fire an object 62 miles up and break the Earth's gravity grip? Goddard tried it. He got written up for noise making, for causing a public disturbance. The town eventually drove him to an army base to do his experiments. The New York Times mocked his science as being humduggery, just quack stuff. They later retracted that. Not until 1969 did he get an apology. He was long dead when the Times said we were wrong. Goddard's principles of rocketry were correct. The Guggenheim Fund gave Goddard some money, but when the Great Depression hit, there was no money for a new, this kind of futuristic rocket missile game that Goddard was in. So he moved to New Mexico, Roswell, New Mexico, The good news is some of those cowboys and ranch hands weren't crazy. They were seeing weird objects in the sky. Goddard was putting all sorts of things up in his Eden Valley Ranch in New Mexico, which now is the area of the White Sands Proving Grounds, where we still pioneer doing missile testing. But Goddard was about it, guys. FDR during World War II wasn't particularly interested in rocketry, but there was somebody very interested in it, and that's Adolf Hitler. And the big thing that occurred, we had Goddard, but Germany during the Weimar Republic and during Hitler's Third Reich, they were rocket crazy. As the Roosevelt administration put money into the Manhattan Project for nuclear atomic bombs, Hitler tripled, quadrupled down on missiles, and his Goddard-like figure was Wernher von Braun. And von Braun was also a genius rocket engineer. He independently or learned from, he had some of the same principles as Goddard, and both Goddard started I think ahead of von Braun, but von Braun's technology outstripped Goddard in the end. And many rocketeers in Nazi Germany, once Hitler came in, recognized that this is not a good government to work for. Some of them fled Nazi Germany, but von Braun doubled down, took all the money, and became an SS officer and took the research and development money to start building for Hitler vengeance weapons. V1s, V2s, V3s. And it's on a base on the Baltic, highly top secret base of Hitler, that after much trial and error, von Braun in the middle of World War II is able to put a rocket up into space. And he develops the V2 in particular, which is a missile that goes 210 miles in arcs. And Hitler wanted to flatten London using von Braun's vengeance weapons, the V2. The V2 is written about in history a lot, in fiction. Thomas Pynchon wrote a novel about the V2, and Michael Chabon did one about von Braun and the V2, because it almost destroyed London. It was the one chance Hitler had around the time of the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944, early 45. The last chance the Nazis had was these V2s being mass-produced and quickening their pace and flattening London. But alas, this didn't work because the Third Reich started crumbling. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, and von Braun is in a pickle because most of their labor to build these V2s were built by Jewish slave labor at Dora, a subcamp of Buchenwald. And the conditions at the Dora camp were heinous because they wouldn't let the Jewish slave labor sleep or eat right. They would work in underground tunnels, unsanitary conditions, because you didn't want to build everything above ground for the Royal Air Force to knock it out. So you did a lot of underground work, and it was beyond belief how horrible the conditions were. And von Braun is culpable, in my mind, for war crimes, if you wanted to go that route with him, for his complicity in what they did using the Dora camp to build his vengeance weapons. But at World War II ended, Hitler's dead. Von Braun's like, if I get captured by Great Britain, I am going to I'll be tried probably for war crimes because I tried to destroy London and killed thousands. He did not want to go work for Joe Stalin in the Soviet Union. So he had to find a way to make a deal with the United States of America. He took 137 of these amazingly talented Nazi rocket engineers and scientists and moved all of their war plans and blueprints on trains, buried all of the technology, blew up the whole of the front of the cave to hide it, traveled into the Alps, and then he sent his brother Magnus von Braun to look for the U.S. Army and surrender and make a deal to come to America, not be charged for war crimes, and he would build missiles for the United States. And we bought. The U.S. government, under Operation Paperclip, moved all of these Nazi scientists to the Roswell, New Mexico area. but more specifically, they were based at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and started working on rockets for the U.S. Army. We called von Braun and others prisoners of peace, POPs. They always had a guard around them. And von Braun now doesn't want to be, we were dividing the world into good Nazis and bad Nazis, or good Germans and bad Germans. And von Braun was determined not to be dubbed one of the Nazis, so he fabricated, and in some ways told some true stories too, about how he would have been killed if he didn't build these, and that he was put in jail once because he was talking about moon rockets. And in his media relations job, von Braun's first speech is to the El Paso Chamber of Commerce when he tells them about the moon and Mars, and starts on never talking about World War II. During World War II, incidentally, he leaves El Paso and goes in 1950 to Huntsville, Alabama. Now, if you pause for a minute after World War II, there's only one time in world history a country has a nuclear monopoly, the United States from 1945 to 49. But suddenly, by 49, the Soviets have the atomic bomb. The Soviets will develop a hydrogen bomb, and the Soviets build the first intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM known as the R-7. So here we thought we had von Braun and all this technology, but Stalin was pouring money into their program, and we were losing. In the Korean War, we don't use missiles because we didn't have a missile program. All we had was von Braun, who was kind of experimenting. But once he moves to Huntsville, the United States government gets really interested in missiles. And von Braun does a facelift because in the 50s, Walt Disney adopts Wernher von Braun. He starts marketing the moon and Mars on his television show in the 50s. Von Braun writes for Collier's and National Geographic and other magazines, and he becomes a celebrity. In America, he becomes our futurist. And so much so that in 1953, Joe Kennedy had an influence with Henry Luce in Time magazine, and they pick as judges for Time's Person of the Year in 1953, the judges are Jack Kennedy and Wernher von Braun. And who they meet here in New York, they go out and eat. The two of them pick Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, as Time's Person of the Year. And Kennedy going out with von Braun talk about World War II. Because according to von Braun and his oral history, including a great one that he gave for the Kennedy Library, that Jack Kennedy would ate up all their clock talking about how his brother, Joe Kennedy, died trying to take out vengeance weapon sites of von Braun. Because Joe Kennedy, they took airplanes, packed it with dynamite or torpex, and Kennedy flew one as a U.S. naval aviator, flew it, and the idea was you point it down like a drone, and then you parachute out at the last minute, and it goes right into the vengeance weapon facility. Well, instead, Joe Kennedy blew up and was dead. And here his brother telling how he died, his brother, trying to take out your weapons. But Kennedy didn't hold it against von Braun because they were 19th century, the same generation. 20th century men, the same generation. Meaning, Eisenhower was born in the 19th century, Stalin 19th century, Khrushchev, de Gaulle, go on and on. But they were of that World War II generation, Kennedy and von Braun. And Kennedy bought the line, Wernher von Braun had to work for Germany, that was his homeland. I had to work in the Pacific for the U.S. because I'm American, and now West Germany is our new friend, and von Braun's working for us. One person who did not like Wernher von Braun in the 50s is Dwight Eisenhower. As president, Ike gives the money to be funded for the Navy Vanguard rockets in the 1950s to deprioritize von Braun and his Huntsville Nazis. And Eisenhower saw the camps in Europe. He knew what von Braun was all about, ultimately, in that era. held it against him. But Ike has a problem because in October 1957, after he already won re-election, but the Soviets put Sputnik up. Sputnik is the size of a basketball, but it's the first satellite. And now Russia's beat us into space. And Ike gets hammered by the Democrats. Leading the charge, going after Eisenhower, being asleep at the wheel, is John F. Kennedy, Senator from Massachusetts, Lyndon Johnson, Senator from Texas, Stuart Symington, Senator from Missouri, and Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington. And they charge Eisenhower in 58 and 59 and 60 with a missile gap. We're losing the Cold War. Eisenhower's asleep at the wheel while the Soviets are beating us in space. And it's quite effective. You do need to know Eisenhower had to respond to Sputnik. And he did so by creating NASA in 1958 as civilian space exploration. He also named 7 Mercury astronauts that are going to be the first Americans in space, all white men, 5'10" and under, who are test pilots and aviators. And everybody wrote about these astronauts, but none of them had went up yet. But there was a good media story that we are fighting in space. Soon we'll have a human being in space. Jack Kennedy uses space very effectively to procure the Democratic nomination in 1960. He calls his program the New Frontier, which is a term that emanates out of NASA. And he ends up, in fact, in the famous debates, Kennedy-Nixon debates of 1960, which some people call the first televised debates. Yes, but they were also the first presidential debates in U.S. history. Kennedy scores points against Nixon, Ike's vice president, on 2 occasions if you go back and watch those debates. One is Kennedy says to Nixon, "You told Mr. Khrushchev that America is #1 in kitchen appliances, and we have color TV. Well, I'll take my TV in black and white, thank you. I want to be #1 in rocket thrust." Nailed Nixon on that. And in another moment, Kennedy nails Nixon as they're talking about national security. He says, "I see, if you're president, I see a Soviet flag planted on the moon. I want to see an American flag on the moon." So he's using this to his advantage, Kennedy. He gets elected, obviously, you all know. Gives the famous Ask Not inaugural. Starts finding a report of when can we put an astronaut in space. And while Kennedy's hemming and hawing, and to be fair to him, he was only president a couple of months, so he's thinking about strategy. The Soviets put up Yuri Gagarin in April 61, and now the Soviets have put the first human being in space. In the late 50s, they'd already put the first creature in space, a dog, Laika, who got dehydrated and incinerated in space. The Soviets have no PETA. They weren't worried about animal safety in their, so it just, but here Kennedy can't, there's no Eisenhower to blame. Gagarin happens while he's president. And he's angry. And lucky for historians like Harold and I, we have a reporter like you, Seide, who was in the White House, and Seide overheard Kennedy, and they let him in an Oval Office kind of meeting, and he overhears Kennedy yelling, I want to be first. Who is the leapfrogging? We've got a leapfrog. I want to be first. I want to know how we beat the Soviets. I don't care, exact words of Kennedy, if it's the janitor over there. Somebody tell me how to beat and leapfrog the Soviets. I found a letter Kennedy wrote to a Princeton student using the term leapfrog about space in the late 1950s, where he was saying that we can't just go cosmonaut, astronaut, or satellite, call and response, counter statements, that we got to go big and beat them. Kennedy hated losing. I know you all have views of him as handsome and glamorous, a great press conferences, whatever image you may or, it might be about his extracurricular activities a night. But you have an image of him. But I'm here to tell you the big thing to know about Jack Kennedy is he hated losing. And he never lost an election his whole life. He won Congress in 1946. He won it in 48. He won it in 50. He runs for the Senate and wins in 52. He runs to the Senate and wins in 58. He wins the presidency in 60. Never lost. His father drilled that into him. If he came number 2 on a yachting race, his dad would say, who got number 1? I don't want him to be about number 2. I have about 50 stories of the variety, but one will suffice due to my time here. Kennedy's playing chess with the White House aide as president, and he's about to be checkmated. And Kennedy bumps the whole table and says, well, I guess we'll never know who won. Okay. So he's determined to be first, and so he green lights to counter Gagarin first, puts Alan Shepard into space. Shepard's from New Hampshire, one of the Mercury 7 astronauts. Shepard's ancestors were on the Mayflower, so he's a perfect first American in space. And he's only up 15 minutes. Up, down, but we claim that we're in space. And Kennedy got mightily impressed by the media press coverage of Alan Shepard, how everybody treated him as the great new American hero. And Kennedy's thinking, wow, I'm going to really benefit from these astronauts being the Kennedy Corps. Kennedy had a proclivity for special operations. He created the SEALs, created the Green Beret. His PT group in World War II was kind of like that. So he liked this, right stuff, macho, astronaut, breaking records bit. It played easily on him. But the same month as Alan Shepard, only weeks after we put our first astronaut up, is when Kennedy calls a joint session of Congress and says on May 25th, 61, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and bring him back alive. Wow. You know what they said at NASA? No way. We have no technology. McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor who was left in the dark on this, got a hold of Kennedy after the speech and said, this is a grandstanding ploy. And Kennedy snapped back, Mac, you don't run for president in your 40s if you don't have a certain kind of moxie. And the big thing Kennedy did well then was galvanize the public using media, press. He had people like Walter Cronkite, who was space crazy, and gave newspaper interviews. And it's bipartisan, the space effort to go to the moon. He sells the Apollo project, cost $25 billion. It's about $185 billion in today's terms, and it was bipartisan. The term moonshot, incidentally, does not emanate originally from NASA or the Apollo program or anything. It is a baseball term. There was a man named Wally Moon for the Los Angeles Dodgers who had hit these towering home runs in the LA Coliseum. And then Scully, a radio announcer, broadcaster, would say, there goes, how about you, it's a moonshot, and the term got popular, and then NASA adopts it to name their manned space center in Houston the Moonshot Command Center. Before it was, today it's the Johnson, manned space. So moonshot started fitting in. Today, we use the term moonshot to mean collective American can-doism. Academics working with the federal government, working with Fortune 500 companies to do something big and remarkable. During Kennedy's presidency, there are 6 Mercury missions. All are successful. The one thing, if you're not a big space buff, just to keep in mind, is Mercury missions are 1 astronaut. Gemini are 2. Apollo are 3. The moon is the prize. And where it's all about incrementalism to get there. And so there's space heroes during the Kennedy years, mainly like John Glenn, who went around Earth 5 times. Most of the astronauts of Mercury were ones in the Kennedy era were Republicans. Kennedy kind of teased them about that. John Glenn was an independent, and Kennedy grabbed him. No, you're a Democrat. He became very close to the Kennedy family. I interviewed Ethel Kennedy, friend of mine down in Palm Beach, and she told me when her husband was shot, Bobby Bill was shot, that what went through her mind is, I've got to call John Glenn to look at my kids at Hickory Hill. And she called Glenn, and Glenn went to the house to look after Bobby's kids. That's how close John Glenn had become a part of the inner circle of the Kennedy family. And of course, 1962, you have the Seattle World's Fair, the Space Needle. I looked at phone books, 1960 yellow pages, nothing about space in Houston. Look at a yellow pages in 1963. It's like Astro babysitting service, Moonburger Diner, all of this, celestial lounge, and the city was transformed. Why Houston? Jack Kennedy barely won Texas in 1960. Barely. And that's with Lyndon Johnson on the ticket with him. And they were worried about the civil rights programs of James Meredith and Ole Miss and Freedom Riders and George Wallace, that he was going to lose Kennedy the re-election in 64 because he would lose the South. So the key to keeping Texas was to placate a man named Albert Thomas, who was the congressman from Houston and happened to be the head of the House Space Appropriations Committee. And so he told Albert Thomas, the Kennedy administration, and Lyndon, we'll get you all this money in Houston, zip it about our civil rights. And the other was Senator Kerr from Oklahoma. And Oklahoma got a ton of contracts and subcontracts for NASA. In fact, May 25th, 61, Kennedy says we're going to the moon. It was coordinated to May 26th to starting the bids for Apollo contracts in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma companies became a part of it, but also Grumman in Long Island and Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. What Kennedy did was pour, I don't like the word pork, but let's call it that, pour pork into the southern zone. Cities like Houston, San Antonio, Huntsville, Biloxi, New Orleans, Jacksonville, Cocoa Beach, Brevard, North Carolina, Hampton, Virginia, suddenly has space tech centers. If FDR had the Grand Coulee Dam and Tennessee Valley Authority and big public works, Eisenhower had the interstate highway system and the St. Lawrence Seaway, Kennedy decided on space technology and space tech corridors. It was one of the smartest decisions he made because the new coin of the realm of superpowerness was going to be space. Not the moon, but satellites. We live in it's a traffic jam of satellites in space right now. There's such a robust business. We don't even realize how much of our lives are based on GPS, weather reconnaissance planes, spy satellites, telecommunications. And that becomes the heart and soul of the new frontier. By the time John Kennedy dies, the day before, he's in San Antonio, Texas, and he's giving yet another great speech about space. But there he talks about the spin-off technology we're getting from our $25 billion investment. GPS, but more to the point, Kennedy's saying in space medicine, CAT scan, MRI, kidney dialysis machines, heart defibrillators, fireproof suits, et cetera, coming out of Kennedy the day before he died, saying that's why we're in space. It's going to pay off. What looks like a big bill for going to the moon is actually the spin-off technology makes it worth it. He was there with Gordon Cooper in San Antonio, one of the Mercury astronauts. Cooper was supposed to go to Dallas with Kennedy, but was called off for a NASA exercise. It's one of the reasons you had the open convertible in Dallas. It was going to be a space hero event in some ways. Day before, last speech Jack Kennedy ever gives is in Houston, Texas, with Congressman Albert Thomas there, and Kennedy makes a mistake. He said, Houston has got the biggest payload ever going to, I'm sorry, he said, Houston has the biggest payroll ever. He meant to say payload. And then he said, all right, I gave you guys in Houston the biggest payroll too. And in fact, the head of the Houston's, Harris County Republicans was George Herbert Walker Bush. And I saw a letter Bush wrote to fellow Republicans, don't criticize Jack Kennedy for all he's done for Houston. Let's all greet him. All Republicans should greet him with honor here in Houston. That didn't happen in Dallas. Dallas was a whole, didn't benefit from any of these Kennedy programs. And on his way, when Kennedy was killed there in Dallas, he was on his way to give a speech at the Trade Mart about how successful his space program was, how many satellites we put up, and how we're beating the Soviets in rocketry, and the whole space exploration number. He never got to give that speech. What I found out, we all know Jackie Kennedy had blood all over her in the pink Chanel suit. But after he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Kennedy, and John Glenn was there with the family. But Jackie goes to see LBJ and Lady Bird, president, and she says to Lyndon, I want Jack's dream kept alive. And Johnson said, we're going to. And they name the Cape Canaveral, Florida, the Kennedy Space Center. So when you look at the moon rocket this summer, 50th anniversary of Neil Armstrong's this July 20th, that rocket left the Kennedy Space Center. And Lyndon keeps it up. It almost gets defunded going to the moon in the 60s, Vietnam, Medicaid, Medicare. Barry Goldwater's against going to the moon on the right. Walter Mondale's against it on the left. Much of the civil rights community thinks it should be spent in cities. We were spending 4.4% of our annual budget in the 60s on NASA, 4.4. Today, it's a third of 1%. They used to say at NASA, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. Space is very expensive. But we kept funding it by default on this sort of Kennedy martyr syndrome. And Werner von Braun and Jackie correspond. Von Braun will put JFK's name on his rocket, keeps his picture there. And it's von Braun who builds the Saturn rockets that Jack Kennedy greenlit. The Saturn V that takes us to the moon was built by Werner von Braun in Huntsville, Alabama. And the big moment when going to the moon almost gets derailed is the Apollo 1 disaster, 1967, when 3 of our astronauts blow up on the launch pad on a test exercise, not the real takeoff. And that's Ed White and Roger Chaffee and Gus Grissom, gone. And many people by 67, when that happened, said, why do we have to do this by the end of the decade, by the way? Because Kennedy gave a political speech and started rattling about this. Now, maybe we're rushing the technology. But it still continued. Richard Nixon is the president when we go to the moon. And I saw in letters from the Kennedy Library, Bill Moyers and Daniel Patrick Moynihan are writing a letter to Nixon's people saying, I think we need to name the rocket the John F. Kennedy, von Braun Saturn V. And I never found Nixon's response, but H.R. Haldeman, some of you remember, his White House chief of staff writes, do not do this to Nixon. It's a NBC News ploy to Kennedyize going to the moon. And on another Haldeman moment, he says, you'll never satisfy liberals. If you name the rocket the JFK, they'll say you didn't do enough for Kennedy. You have to rename the moon Kennedy. And so Nixon just stays away from the name Kennedy. When I interviewed Neil Armstrong, on Apollo 11, they had a 50-50 chance of success. That's what Armstrong thought. They were not clear. So, Nixon had William Safire write a disaster letter to the American people about the either dead Apollo 11 astronauts or a mishap. There was a real worry they'd get stranded on the moon, and how strange would that be? We can't bring them back alive, but they're sitting there on the moon. But you all know the Apollo 11 worked. It's an engineering miracle. The rocket's bigger than the Statue of Liberty. The engineering is spectacular. The reason Armstrong did not want to talk to me when I wrote him and didn't like the press was he constantly said it took 400,000 people to get to the moon. And everybody knows me. And I don't like, he wanted to, I have enough fame and enough limelight. He hated celebrityhood, Armstrong. He went after Apollo 11 to become an engineering professor at University of Cincinnati. Very self-deprecating, humble public servant. But what everybody's going to focus this summer on, and it's already everywhere, that's one giant step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Neil Armstrong wrote that line himself. He test marketed it on one person, his brother, at a kitchen table. But what's not talked about much is when they leave the moon. You see Armstrong in that bulky suit starting to climb the ladder, and suddenly you hear him say to Buzz in a kind of a cryptic way, "Did you leave the packet?" And in the packet, Aldrin leaves it. In that packet are medals honoring the 3 dead Apollo 1 astronauts, Chaffee, White, and Grissom. But also, our country cast medals to honor the Soviets, cosmonauts who died in their program. So if you go to our moon site up there on the moon, in that packet would be medals honoring, for example, Yuri Gagarin, who died in a test flight crash in Russia. So it was a healing message. 550 million people watched going to the moon. The world watched. Even Pravda said congratulations in Russia. And when our astronauts splashed down and they were finally safe, and Nixon did a nice job talking on the telephone with them, and they put them in quarantine, but they didn't care about Nixon and NASA. They cared about Jack Kennedy's challenge. And right at the moment they were safe, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, at the big board at NASA's Mission Control in Houston, they put Kennedy's May 25th, 61 pledge on the board. And underneath it said, July 1969, task accomplished. It was treated, we think of Apollo as being a modern day tech miracle of engineering. It was actually a hangover of World War II. All of these engineers, radar specialists, emerged out of the Second World War to get us there. And we took a lot of risk in World War II, humans. We're more risk averse now than we were then. And so it's a lot of people who died trying to get to the moon. There's also a little note left at Kennedy's grave at Arlington Cemetery. A unknown person put a bouquet of flowers on Kennedy's grave and a little note card that said, "Mr. President, the eagle has landed." And now when we look at space, we're looking at technology and space exploration as being perhaps Kennedy's biggest accomplishment. I'm doing a program with Jeff Bezos and Carolyn Kennedy and Michael Collins up in the Kennedy Library in a week or so. And I know Carolyn Kennedy thinks that the moonshot is going to be what hundreds of years from now Kennedy's going to be remembered to, more than the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin Crisis, because it triggered computers. The computer chip, the transistor, was not invented till the late 50s by Texas Instruments. And NASA's the first to use to do test runs of new kinds of computers and chips, and all the technology that leads to the Silicon Valley and beyond. NASA's the prototype for it. So Jeff Bezos now is trying to have privatization of space, Blue Origin, Elon Musk, and all these people are trying to get into the privatization of space game. And all of them, their heroes are Jack Kennedy, John Glenn, Alan Shepard, and that generation that allowed us to first break the shackles of Earth. Thank you.
If you remember the press conference the astronauts had when they came out of quarantine, the international press was there. I would have expected them to be jubilant, enthusiastic, and jumping up and down with victory, but instead they were so glum and downcast, and it seemed that was the last place any of them wanted to be. And I wondered about that, and also one of the members of the press asked them, "Did you see stars?" And he said, "No, we didn't see stars." Well, how can you go into space and not see stars? And the third thing is, well, the last one is most important.
None of these astronauts at that point they were instructed not to be overly hamming it up with the press, but believe me, they were all happy to be alive, happy to be a success. They knew their lives were going to be changed forever. But your general point, I asked Neil Armstrong, I'm a humanities person, and these guys are, particularly Armstrong, is a Purdue University engineer that thinks like this. He's a slide rule guy, really intensely that way. And I got him to talk about his Korean War service, which he hated to do because that generation didn't believe in bragging. He was an amazing Korean War fighter pilot. But I said to Armstrong, Mr. Armstrong, didn't you ever, like going up right before you went to the moon, look up at it and see that beautiful luminous moon, controls our tides and our weather and calendar, and just think, my God, I'm going to be standing there looking down at Earth? No. That was all he said to me. He was very much like that. And now Buzz Aldrin is starting to enjoy, Armstrong knew how to readjust to life as a professor in engineering, but Buzz Aldrin, who was brilliant, he was MIT engineering doctorate, but Buzz never kind of could find a role for himself the way Armstrong did. And Michael Collins wrote the best memoir, very enthusiastic. You should read it. It's The New Yorker, for example, thinks it's the classic book on space exploration. Is Michael Collins, the one who had to watch the other two go there.
Well, the other thing was, within a year, only one of them was still working for NASA, and they had all kinds of social problems. Some became alcoholics, they got divorced, changed careers. I'm wondering why?
Well, divorce is kind of a human state, but those three of all did very well. None of Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. Collins went on to run the Smithsonian Institute's Air and Space Museum, and Armstrong was very, very successful. So, what more to your point is, after Apollo, Nixon canceled a lot. Like we've had 12 moonwalkers, all men. We still haven't had a woman on the moon. So that's going to be a big first, the first woman on the moon. I write in my book about Mercury 13 astronauts, women trained for space, that were nixed due to misogynistic gender terms for patriarchy, whatever the right term for it would be. But they were perfectly able to go into space, but they got nixed. And Nixon then cancels the end of the Apollo because if you remember the Tom Hanks movie Apollo 13, that was almost a disaster. And the thought is, we've been to the moon, let's start Apollo funding once we went, due to lack of media attention. Everyone got less and less ratings. We did the International Space Station and other forums. I mean, Jet Propulsion Laboratories put a rover on Mars, but nothing's generated that enthusiasm as the race to beat the Soviets to the moon that Jack Kennedy put in sports terms, football. At Rice, Kennedy famously says, they ask why go to the moon? Why climb Mount Everest? Why does Rice play University in Texas in football? Because it's a challenge. And Kennedy would also do a great job that no president's done since in telling everybody it was expensive. He'd always say, it's expensive space, it's going to cost you 50 cents a week and you 50 cents a week, but I need you. Are you willing to beat the Soviets? And no Republican wanted to say, I don't want to beat the Soviets to the moon. So until now. But he had the Democratic Party worked around, and Lyndon knew how to get the Democratic votes, so they just kept it funded.
You mentioned Neil Armstrong praising the thousands of workers who got all of them to the moon. And for me, reading the book, one of the most poignant and heretofore unknown stories was Victor Prather. And I'd appreciate it if you could share it with everybody and tell me how you came upon that anecdote.
Thank you for reading the book. Victor Prather is just another one of this generation. He was doing right when the Mercury are going up, we were trying him for how you land in the ocean, and he had an astronaut suit, and he drowned in a training exercise. Would have been one of our great astronauts, pilots, right? And Kennedy got word of it, and he very appropriately called Prather's widow and the children, and didn't just meet them for a minute, but had spent a lot of time with them at the White House, telling the children how great their father was and the like. that's how, we forget how many pilots died out at Edwards Air Force Base also, doing this. This is really risky stuff, being shot up into a rocket into space. But because we made it to the moon and back, people sometimes don't underestimate the risk and danger. But thank you for reading that and picking up on that story.
My name is Rao. My question is, I have been hearing about privatizing the space travel. Usually the public sector, the people's money funds it, trillions of dollars. Now some privateer comes and buys it for $39,000 of small space and uses it, makes profit. What do you think about this whole privatization?
There's a lot going on in space right now. It's a very hot field, but as you're mentioning, there are these private companies that are going into it. Now, NASA this last week is announcing that if you have enough money, if you have $50 million, you can maybe go to visit our International Space Station, take that cash, 12 visitors a year paying a big check, and that money would be put into NASA for helping to keep it funded in a proper way. But more to the point, everybody's looking for federal government contracts. Musk is Mars. And Bezos has Blue Moon Project. He wants to go back to the moon and use moon as a stepping stone to Mars. Trump keeps going both directions and confusing everybody. What does it all mean is I think we're worried that China is doing so much in space exploration. Many of our rockets that go to the International Space Station now are Russian rockets. So the idea is that we could build ones in the U.S. from one of these private companies. It would be maybe jobs and useful. But in my book, there's a moment when Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's son, during the Kennedy years, there's some talk, can U.S. and Russians go to the moon together? Be like us going, some people are saying we might go with Japan to Mars. And this was pretty popular thought, but Sergei Khrushchev asked his father, Dad, are we going to go to the moon with the Americans? Would we ever do such a thing? And Nikita Khrushchev said, no, never. And why? And he said, because then the Americans will know what we don't have. They were bluffing a lot of their technology, Russia, and if we did transparency games, we would have known that they really weren't as good as they were saying they were, that we feared. And incidentally, we do now know from the Soviet archive, 1991, end of the Soviet Union, Russia was all the way trying to get to the moon up until the very late 60s. There really was a moon race.
Thank you for your talk. Look forward to reading the book. Listening to your talk, one can reach the conclusion, and I want to know if it's accurate, that Kennedy's motivations were 99%, if not 100% political in terms of the space race, competition with Russia, economic development in Texas, and a host of other things. In your research, did you find evidence of his actual interest in the science?
Yes, I think what you said is, essentially true. I don't know the number I would put in on how much, but it was political and national security reasons. But Kennedy loved the ocean, as you all know, and the vastness of it. And he really meant it when he's talking about our galaxy as the new ocean and the new place. He started really learning to love going to the moon project when he got to know those astronauts, because they were extraordinary. He admired them, he befriended them, and then he would regularly go to Cape Canaveral and Houston and Huntsville regularly because he got addicted to this program, and he had his face hanging out there. He's calling the moonshot while a lot of people are wondering whether we can do it. And so it is political, but he took a great interest in it because enough people convinced him correctly that satellites were the new technology of the future and that the United States had to keep a tech edge over Russia and others. And so I think he did right, but what motivated him was politics in the end, and the timing of history. I mean, no computer chips in the late 50s, no going to the moon, no. everything kind of came together in a certain right way. Incidentally, the senator in Florida, George Smathers, was really angry at Kennedy's civil rights. And that was one of Jack Kennedy's favorite Senate friends. They were livid, but he wasn't livid, Smathers, about getting money poured into the Space Coast. Thank you, guys.